For decades, we've believed the asteroid impact was it. But what if that cosmic event was just the final blow? We're going back millions of years to uncover the forgotten killers and unseen forces that tipped the scales for the age's biggest rulers. The truth is far more complicated and far creepier than you think. It's easy to look at a fully grown Tyrannosaurus rex and assume that sheer bulk guaranteed eternal dominion, a powerful, armored empire of tooth and claw. But history shows us that apparent dominance is often the most beautiful illusion. These colossal creatures were magnificent apex predators. Yes, but they were also immensely specialized, building an entire ecological pyramid that rested upon a surprisingly fragile foundation. Unlike modern megafauna, which can adapt their diets or behaviors, many dinosaur groups had become locked into deeply complex nutritional and structural roles within their ecosystems. This reliance meant that if one key element, say, the flora, or the cycle of global climate, shifted even slightly, several species would have no readily available backup plan. They were victims of overoptimization, reaching a point where they outgrew their own natural resilience. True planetary stability doesn't rest on brute strength. It rests on redundancy and diversification, things that simply weren't built into the late Cretaceous food web. For all their terrifying power, what ultimately made them vulnerable was not a single giant asteroid, but the way their sprawling, specialized world reached an unsustainable tipping point. But even before hitting that fateful asteroid path, the colossal creatures of the late Cretaceous were already dealing with an environmental nightmare, a rapidly changing climate clock. Massive, sustained volcanic eruptions in what we now call the Deccan Traps poured staggering amounts of gas into Earth's atmosphere for hundreds of thousands of years. These sheer volumes of gases, loaded with carbon dioxide and sulfur, acted like throwing open every thermostat on the planet, driving up global temperatures dramatically. It wasn't a slow creep. It was an accelerated period of greenhouse heating that destabilized existing ecosystems everywhere. For giant animals whose metabolisms required constant stability, like the high-energy carnivores, this instability was a crippling drain on energy and resources. Picture suddenly unreliable weather patterns, drastic ocean acidification, and seasonal shifts they had no natural defense against. The pressure ramped up so intensely that by the late Maastrichtian period, life across multiple trophic levels entered a state of systemic crisis. It's almost like humanity finally realizing the importance of climate control after centuries ignoring subtle warning signs. These mounting geological stresses were already weakening the entire megafaunal structure, setting the stage for an extinction event, whether or not the impactor arrived. But before we talk about the impactor, we have to understand what was happening under the surface, a subtle but profound biochemical catastrophe. Picture this. Global oceanic oxygen levels began dipping significantly, slowly strangling enormous marine ecosystems from below. This wasn't just localized pollution. It was a planetary metabolic stress that funneled up through every level of the food chain. When the primary resource, breathable air and clean water, became less reliable, life had to adapt with revolutionary speed. Suddenly, sheer size became a liability. Maintaining vast bodies required immense amounts of energy, an energy source made precious by declining atmospheric oxygen. The swift, efficient creatures managed this scarcity, forcing herbivores and carnivores alike to completely overhaul their diets. Simply put, the planet decided efficiency mattered more than raw power, leaving many magnificent but metabolically costly giants far behind. But the world wasn't solely a dinosaur feeding ground. Life was diversifying, and competition was quietly rising from below. While the giant reptiles filled every corner with sheer brute size, smaller, previously underestimated groups started to thrive. Think of early mammals, some no bigger than your hand, that mastered the art of resourcefulness and low-impact living. They weren't built for spectacle. They were built for stealth, forming an adaptable niche that kept them safe from megapredators. And look up, creatures evolving wings found remarkable success too. These flying reptiles didn't need to challenge a asterisk Tyrannosaurus in a head-on brawl. Instead, they conquered the vertical realm and the skies above it. This pattern played out across epochs, showing that while sheer power was impressive, flexible design proved to be the ultimate long-term strategy. It was this rise of specialized rivals, be they burrowing mammals or fast flyers, that fundamentally shifted the evolutionary balance of the ancient world. But if we set aside that initial cataclysmic impact, the actual physical blow, the real story of collapse was what happened immediately afterward. The dust plumes that pumped into the atmosphere created an unstoppable global gloom, plunging Earth into what scientists call an impact winter. Solar energy, the foundational power source for all life on our planet, simply vanished. Plants couldn't photosynthesize, and photosynthesis is the root of every food chain imaginable. Starvation didn't just strike at treetop levels. It started deep in the soil and moved upward relentlessly. Imagine a continuous, suffocating global famine, wiping out everything from tiny insects to the great giant sauropods, all because the sunlight was masked by kilometers of grit. For decades, scavengers like the small mammalian ancestors we know today would have struggled merely for carrion, a miserable diet that simply couldn't sustain massive biomass. The resources were depleted too quickly, and the ecosystem didn't have enough time to bounce back from the shockwaves. It was a slow, cold death by resource exhaustion, proving that sometimes surviving the biggest bang is easier than enduring the resulting silence. But the true nightmare wasn't just the asteroid itself. It was what came next, a rapid plunge into a devastating impact winter. For months, global circulation patterns were choked by dust and soot, plunging the planet into an unnatural twilight. This perpetual gloom meant that crops couldn't photosynthesize, effectively starving out the base of almost every food chain on Earth. Imagine the unimaginable scarcity. Giant fern forests, once lush emerald seas, began to wither and blacken in this cosmic autumn. The specialized diets of megafauna simply could not adapt to this sudden global famine. Herbivores started struggling for meager mouthfuls of dying foliage, while the apex predators, the tyrannosaurs and triceratops alike, found their powerful metabolic engines idling with nothing to hunt or graze upon. This widespread starvation was a slow, chilling curtain call far more deadly than any initial blast. It was an extinction event by digestive tract, freezing metabolism in place within weeks of utter dark. But when the massive megafauna faced ecological collapse, it wasn't brute strength or sheer size that saved life. It was adaptability. The survivors were not necessarily the largest or the fiercest. They were simply the cleverest and most flexible. We see this perfectly in the early mammals, like the groups leading toward the primates. They possessed increasing intelligence, allowing them to utilize tools and communicate complex warning signals, a massive advantage over creatures relying solely on instinct. Furthermore, their body plans favored metabolic efficiency. Unlike giant sauropods that required immense grazing grounds, these smaller organisms could survive on varied diets and function effectively on fewer resources, a concept we know well today when global supply chains break down. This metabolic flexibility was key. It meant they weren't locked into one food source or habitat, allowing them to thrive everywhere from lush rainforests to drier scrubland. For millions of years following the KPG boundary, those traits paid dividends. They were adaptable enough to wait out the harsh aftermath and eventually fill the newly empty ecological niches, leaving behind a world that looks strikingly similar to today's own ecosystem. The sudden silence that followed the Chicxulub impact was terrifying, but for millions of small, surviving creatures, primarily mammals, it was actually a radical opportunity. The colossal titans were gone, leaving behind vast ecological voids. Niches on Earth suddenly opened up for anything adaptable enough to fill them. In the darkness following the KPG boundary event, life found unexpected allies in resourceful survivors that had previously lived in the shadow of giant reptiles. These weren't just patches-up animals. They possessed a blueprint for entirely new existence, intelligence, advanced reproductive cycles, and unparalleled versatility. Over the next few millennia, mammals developed from small nocturnal predators into every kind of creature imaginable, from towering early hominids to graceful megafauna across Pangaea's fragmented continents. This wasn't merely a recovery. It was an evolutionary reset button pushed by environmental chaos. It set the stage for the explosive diversification that defines our own era, ultimately leading us, Homo sapiens, standing here today as direct heirs to that struggle and astonishing adaptability. The extinction was not a single moment. It was an epic decline. Life is relentlessly cyclical, constantly pruning what is too big or unwilling to adapt. The real lesson isn't just about losing the dinosaurs. It's realizing that complexity, vulnerability, and profound systemic change are inherent parts of nature's ongoing drama.